the old Ingmar. Ah.
Tell me about Ingmar Johansson.
About him personally?
Yes.
Ingmar Johansson, born in Göteborg, and a little bit of a troublemaker there as a young boy. And he did his military service in the Navy, and that's where he was introduced to boxing. He was in a couple of brawls, and then his commanding officer thought, now we'd better teach this boy a little bit of boxing, and he could sort of take him off the street fights. And he became our top amateur boxer, Swedish champion, and he went to the Olympics in Helsinki, where he got disqualified for non-boxing in the final. He was against an American, presently I've forgotten the name, that was a fearful fighter who had mauled a couple, and Ingmar said, it's not worth my head to be beaten out by this guy. So he fought, but so defensively as a silver medalist that they disqualified him, but they restored it later. He got a silver medal later. Coming back from Helsinki, he decided to go professional, because there was a man in Gothenburg called Edvin Ahlqvist, who was a promoter for fighters, a very honest, straightforward and good man, and he saw a lot in Ingmar, and he was the one that presented the name Thor's hammer of Ingmar Johansson's right hand. And they made him train right, eat right, do right. And Ingmar rose to the top and became European champion. And everybody in Europe believed that this was one of the greatest fighters that time in the world. And this was, I think, 1957, 58. It was an American boxer called Eddie Mason, who was the #1 challenger. He was going to meet Floyd Patterson about the World Championships. He was just going on a little business to Europe first, training town. He was going to meet some European clot called Ingmar Johansson in Gothenburg, and then he was going to go back. And so he did. He came to Gothenburg and he climbed the ring, and it took 1 minute and 10 minutes, and Eddie Mason was on the floor. And that was, of course, not what people had reckoned with, especially not those who bought big ringside tickets and didn't even get a seat. So automatically then, Ingmar came up as a challenger. And it was set for a fight in June 1959. Ingmar flew over with the whole of his family and stayed up in the Catskills. He put his training camp, and he became very popular. What I liked especially about Ingmar is his great feeling for his family. He, wherever he went, he took his mother and his father with him. And throughout life after father died, when he lived down in Florida, every year for several months his parents came over. And he bought them a house in Sweden. He wasn't at the beginning as lucky with the ladies. Let's say he was very lucky with the ladies, because there was a lot of ladies that wanted him. But he wasn't very good at keeping him then until later years when he'd given up boxing. And he is actually, if you think about it, the last white world champion in boxing. And I say real champion.
Right.
And he shares the honor with Floyd Patterson of, I think, being the last real heavyweight champion. There was only one champion in those days.
Right.
How many do they have today? 5,
Right.
6?
Mm-hmm.
There were only 8 world champions in the world. Today there are 73. So I figure that the crown of any class in those days means a lot more than a crown today. And he stayed on. He bought a home in Lighthouse Point within the city of Pompano Beach in Florida, where he became known as a good golfer and a good friend, someone that was always present when the city needed him. The police department he supported, and I met the chief of police many times, and he said to me that we are very proud to have a man of Ingmar Johansson standing in the city. But that was not the whole story. I happened to be living in the same city as Ingmar. We did a lot of living together. I asked Ingmar, what about your friends, etc. He says, you see, I have good friends and I have bad friends. I have good friends like you. Come over here, we talk about it. But you see, about maybe once a month or so, I need my bad friends. He says, there might be some used car salesman or something like that, he said, in another town. And I go and I see them. And we go out and we just roll our heads and hats for 3 days, he says. We sing, drink, beer, chase girls, do everything we can for 3 days until I'm totally out. Then I go home and meet my good friends. And I said, how do you, it's like, you know, he said, I am to me. And then she said, and I found a philosopher, and he said, Lars, I have nothing that I've done in my world. My whole life, I have done nothing but smacking people in the head. What do they expect? Huh? A Harvard professor? And then he laughed and went out. And then the phone rings, and he had married. Wife was studying actually in Sweden, and she became a lawyer after many years. And she said to him something with no, I haven't done that. So I asked him after, what haven't you done? I hadn't cut the grass, and I hadn't done this. I said, well, why not? He said, I didn't want to. How? Yeah, he says, when my wife is here, she says, answer the phone when the phone rings. She says, cut the grass, do this, do that. And I resented. I don't answer the phone, I don't cut the grass because I don't want to cut the grass. Oh, but when she isn't here, then I said, well, how do you do it then? Oh, I cut the grass all the time, I always answer the phone, but I don't want to be told.
How did you get to a point where you broadcast the Johansson-Patterson fight?
I got my...
Tell the story of how you became the broadcaster for the Johansson fight.
Oh, I had done some broadcasting in 1948 doing the Olympics for Sweden over the Swedish service of the BBC. I had a couple of hours a day that I was broadcasting. All the various sports, anything from soccer to boxing. And this fight with Ingmar was going to take place. Sweden wanted to listen to it, and the Swedish state radio didn't want to send it because it was immoral. Professional fighting is immoral. Mm-hmm. So then Philips company in Sweden, which is the big equivalent to Norelco here, so, decided to send this fight over the Radio Luxembourg. And they needed someone to do the direct broadcast. So I reckoned very rapidly that I was basically the only one who's ever done direct broadcast in my sports in Sweden, outside of the Swedish state radio. So I called up the head of the Swedish Philips, who happened to know, and said, I see you got me a job. He said, what job? Where's that fight? I said, why should I do that? I said, because there isn't anyone else around who've done it. That's roughly the cover. And we then formed a program. We had to have a broadcast from New York for a full week to teach the Swedes how to tune in to Radio Luxembourg, so they were really on the station at this very night. So I was over in New York and did pre-fight programs, and got my first fill of American trade unions.
God.
I just went out with my recorder, which was a sort of a tape recorder Swiss that I just had hang on the side and a microphone. Did interviews with people about the fight. It came back to ABC, which gave us the Stooges and facilities. And I was going to send this. And they said, what's that? I said, that's a tape I did. Yeah, who's your producer? I haven't got the producer. Who's your technician? I haven't got the technician. They asked, have the tape, can I please send it? Oh, no. That was a no-no. So I had to hire a couple of technicians, and I hired a producer, and they were sitting in the studio playing cards or whatever they were doing, and because, I mean, they couldn't splice the tape or anything. They didn't understand a word of Swedish. So I had that, and then I came to think, oh, it might be, that's the difference between Sweden and America. America has a habit of creating jobs. Sweden has a habit of cutting them. Or something that. Anyway, the broadcast went very well, and I remember I climbed the ring, and no one was allowed up in the ring. Howard Cosell, he just jumped up. Everybody knew Howard Cosell, right? So he went up with the mic, and of course, no one knew me, and I came with my microphone up. So I remember Lars Ottoson, so I took up my passport, and I put my thumb over Otto in Ottoson, and I just showed it, and I said, I'm Ingmar's brother. I'm going to go, oh, they said, Mr. Johansson. I went up with the microphone. Because otherwise I couldn't explain to them the Swedish Broadcasting, etc.
Sure.
They want the identification of that. So I thought that was the easiest way. And with a treasure at home, I have a picture that is, as they're making a film about him, they have a picture of Ingmar Johansson standing between Howard Cosell and myself.
I'll be there.
A treasure of the day, because I understand that they're making a film about his life.
Mm-hmm.
Like quite a remarkable cat. So.
We're going to show
Thank
you.
very much. I mean, today Ingmar, he went back to Sweden a couple of years ago. And he is still probably the most popular figure Sweden has ever had. And he is a dear character to Swedes because he was a good man. And we all feel a little bit sorry today because he is suffering from Alzheimer's now. And there are still people coming by his house, where he lives outside Stockholm, stopping the car to see if they can get a glimpse of him.
We're going to show you a movie. We're going to show you a movie. I want you to see this.
Okay. What movie is that?
Watch this.
Huh?
We're going to show it right here.
Yeah. Okay, get the third one now. Yeah.
Remember that?
Oh, yeah. Very clean.
Yep, real clean.
Very.
This would have stopped that earlier. You've seen how thinner the heavyweights were in those days, right?
Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I saw. That was fun. I haven't seen that since 60, 61, but they still were playing it. The Swedish movie houses, etc. Yes, 40 years since I saw that fight.
Brings back memories.
Ingmar didn't have that fight at home or anything. He never had anything. So that was really something.
You told me the story about how you got to Nuremberg. Nuremberg trials. Could you tell me that? The stake?
Yeah, of course it started long. I started in Sweden wanting to go
Right.
to England.
Sure.
But that's... shall I start with that? Or
Sure, absolutely. Start at the beginning.
I was night editor or city desk editor of a Swedish local paper, one of the 5 big ones in Sweden. And I saw an ad that they needed someone, it was during the war, in London. The BBC needed a Swede for the Scandinavian region, and I figured, okay, that would be nice. So I had an appointment at the British Embassy in Stockholm for an interview for the job. And I didn't speak much English, so I I sat on the train up to Stockholm with a dictionary, and I trained, and I learned a couple of sentences that I could repeat over. So after a while at the embassy, and I gave my name, etc., the press attaché by the name of Ledbetter, who spoke Swedish very well, said, "Okay, how is your English?" So I started to unload everything that I had learned in English and didn't let him in. And he said, "Oh, yeah, sounds okay, but..." and then he went back to Swedish. He said, "Probably you feel more comfortable." Yeah. So I thought I got over that one. And then he said, "Oh, we have a little translation for you to do." And they put me in a room and they asked me to translate an editorial from the Times. And I said, "Oh my God, the Times is one of the most difficult it could be." So I just looked at the no dictionary, nothing in the name, and I read it, and I recognized it. And I said, "Oh my God." I wrote an editorial about that in our newspaper about a week ago. So I wrote it, and then I lended it in to him and said, "I don't know, I didn't do a translation of it." I said, "I suppose you wanted this broadcast to Scandinavia, and therefore I sort of wrote it so the Scandinavians would more understand the concept of the issue, etc." He says, "Very good." He says, "That's what you should do," and I got the job. So I came over to England, and there was a very good dear Swede who is foreign correspondent who'd been left there by the war, who gave me a couple of things to translate that day. I remember that day. And translate into Swedish. And then he called me in and he said, "Lars, how's your English?" Oh, I said, "Not so good." "No, I recognize that. You see, there is no general by the name of Staff."
General Staff.
So, how could I learn English? Yeah, I did. I went to the movies at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I saw the same film 4 or 5 times over, you know. Didn't understand in the beginning, at the end I could repeat all the... And that's how I learned English. Because, you know, the school English is never sufficient. So that's why I took a great interest, and then became interested in Nuremberg for the reason that I worked extra for the Svenska Dagbladet, which is equivalent to the Swedish Times, is the conservative daily in Sweden. And I helped the reporter there very much, the correspondent. And Nuremberg became then something that was approaching. And I heard of, when I read about Robert Jackson, and his work to assemble a group of people for the prosecutional team. And that made me interested. I read about it, but I liked a little bit of the things he said and his philosophy. So I said, I'd like to go to Nuremberg. So, and I think I told my head of the Scandinavian region I wanted to go to Nuremberg. And he said, yeah, of course, if you can get there and if you can get in. So he left the rest to me. And that wasn't easy, alone in London. But in every big institution or bureaucratic institution, there's always some people on the lower manager level who can do anything for you without their bosses knowing it. So I found a Miss Peacock, a frumpy little lady in the back office in the ground floor, who was in charge of sort of buying tickets and fixing passes and other things for the European region's referent reporters. And I made myself friendly with her by lunching with her in the cafeteria, etc. And hearing one day, and I didn't mention anything of this because I wanted to have a soft point, and I found it when she said that she hadn't had a decent meal for years and there's no meat around in the rationing. So I felt that must be the weak point. So by that time the Swedish Lloyd's after the war had just started weekly sailings to London with their then luxury ship Saga, and they were going up to tying up by the Tower Bridge in London, and a friend of mine had handed the PR for that line. So I asked him for a steak and told him that you get me a steak, you get me to Nuremberg. There I want to go. And he extracted a steak from the chef of the ship, and I put the steak on Miss Peacock's desk. And she said, "What's that for?" And I said, "For Nuremberg." "Oh, God, my love," she said. And then I said, "Yeah, I really want to go there." "Nuremberg," she said. And she said something like, "Oh, dear, dear, I suppose I have to take the Turk off the list then." And then she found me, or I found a transportation to Nuremberg in the back of a Peugeot two-seater. You know, the cars that you can open the back, and they had a seat, and I was sitting there, and of course it started raining. The morning we left London, and didn't stop raining until we got to Nuremberg, and I spent the whole trip on dirty roads and worn bridges under a piece of rubber canvas in the back.
Wow.
So I got to Nuremberg, and that's all.
What was your job at Nuremberg?
My job?
Yep.
To look. I didn't know much about Nuremberg. I mean, I was just a young reporter, and I don't think that anybody thought that I was a reporter. I mean, here comes a guy that looks like, I looked younger than I was. I mean, someone that looks 19, 20, and you have all the big reporters of the world and the foreign correspondents and everyone is sitting there. So I thought, I bet anything I can do. I don't understand too much of what the jurists say and what they discuss, but at least I've got two eyes. I see with, and I can tell them what I see. And I said, and maybe that is interesting to people, because people in general know jurists either and don't understand it either. So if I tell them what I see, they probably understand that better.
Sure.
So I described how I felt about the people who were there, the accused, and their reactions. I mean, it was a highlight for me to be able to say Goering is eating an apple, is offering Hess to sit beside him a bite of the apple. Hess looks at him with his hollow eyes and shakes his head, he doesn't want anything. And Goering looks back at Hess and thinking, you really don't know what you're missing, or something like that. And I was, Streicher up there, he's poking his nose again. This roughly what I was saying, and then described the city, what happening, and tried to tell them how the prisoners were living. I was allowed to tour and see the different cells, etc. Could come up and say, for instance, Hess is just sitting in his, Goering is laying on his bed, Jodl and Keitel is, I remember specifically Jodl, whose cell was so tidy, was the blanket all folded up, I mean, typical military to the point. It was a little bit different in the character, but that's what I try to tell people. And remember I shared the room. We were 4 in a room. We lived in a place called Schloss Farben. That was IG Farben Bayer, you know, the one that made aspirin, one of their own. They had a big castle, and the press was housed there. We slept on camping beds, about 4 or 5 in a room. And another young reporter was there, and I found that out later, that we actually slept in the same room. It was very famous today, Andy Roney.
Andy Rooney.
60 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
He was working for Stars and Stripes as a young war reporter.
That's right.
He was still a bit older than I am. And I don't think we ever had any beer together. But
Here we are.
I don't think they realize.
I figured it out, but that's all. I never met him here.
Yeah.
Never seen him wear anything. But I am going to approach him and say, because we have several things that we've done. First of all, I knew we shared room there. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know my existence. But the funny thing is, he wrote an article about Hemingway some time ago, that he did not like Hemingway for certain reasons. And I like to tell him that when I wrote my book about Africa, I had a chapter about Hemingway that was taken out of the book when it was published in England, where I happened to have the same publisher as Hemingway. Because I did tell a couple of stories about Hemingway. He wasn't very liked over there. And I thought of telling Andy Roney that he was pretty well right. I remember in the Amboseli Game Reserve in Africa, there was a game warden called Taberer, and I came there with my photographer and met Taberer, and I showed Taberer a magazine article, I think it was Look magazine, that had a big issue with Hemingway in Africa. Among other things, there was one photo of Hemingway with a rifle pointing at a rhino, and on the other side was a picture of Hemingway with his foot posing on the rhino, together with a big Maasai warrior. And the article wrote there's something about this Maasai warrior that was a friend of Hemingway, that went on lion hunt with Hemingway. He was an old friend, and Hemingway had taught him a lot of things. But it was very strange, because that Maasai was not exactly that. He was a sergeant major in the Burmese, in the English Burmese army, and he was more or less of a safe and the lifeguard for Hemingway. So when I showed this article to Tabor, the game warden, said, "That?" He said, "Yeah, he was here." He said, "Oh, that rhino?" He said, "That rhino died of natural causes. It's my rhino number 17. He had numbers on all the rhinos all around. And when someone came in and said that the rhino had died, Hemingway rushed out and posed on it as if he had killed it."
That's funny.
So I said, "Is this the story?" He said, "Yeah, you see, if you want to know more," he said, "you can ask the game warden up in Murchison Falls. When the plane landed at night and he didn't want to cross the river because he was sitting in his airplane all night, they didn't even put up the tent because Hemingway was so afraid of the lions and stuff around. So He sat in the seat of the airplane all the night until we could take him across the river.
Wow.
So I wrote a chapter, and I set it up Hemingway as a writer. I just wrote the headline, Hemingway, why did you do this to me?
Yeah.
And I think this is about the same thing as Andy Roney had, so I was going to send that.
At Nuremberg, did you see Robert Jackson in action?
Yes.
What did you think? What was your impression?
I can't tell you. I just really don't remember. I saw this man. I saw several of these men in suits, you know, doing their job. I didn't think very much about Robert Jackson, except, I mean, he was very direct and very pointed in his, and he didn't prosecute.
That's
He stated.
Right.
He came up and stated facts, and they were not something. They were. But otherwise, I had my best impression of him is from what I read about him in London, and how he tried to explain how he was going to put his team together. And of course, today, what he did in Nuremberg was basically to lay the foundation for the fact that no obedience to any military or civilian superior is an excuse for committing war crimes or any other crimes. And I mean, basically, if you look at it, that is the essence of the whole Nuremberg trial. And that was what he, long before the trial, had set as a goal. And he succeeded. And I think that is his greatness. That's what his testament to the world, which is today tested, of course, in the trial in Hague against Milosevic.
Absolutely right.
I mean, the aura of Nuremberg hangs over that Hall of Justice in Hague. And so he is partly there.
That's right. Were you at Nuremberg at the end? When the verdicts were rendered, were you at Nuremberg?
If I like Nuremberg?
No, when the verdicts and judgments were given at Nuremberg, were you broadcasting then?
No.
No? When Goering got life, or when
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, when Goering was going to be sentenced to be hanged from the court, were you there? Goering, Hess, all those defendants.
All those defendants.
Were you?
I tell you what, when I looked out there on the defendants, so many of them were old men. And they looked no difference to the old people who sat in rocking chairs in Miami Beach. Strip officers of their uniforms, especially the generals, that are in their 60s. They look at any 60-year-old. It could be but when they at the same time lose their dignity the way they did, they look even worse. I thought it was a sorry-looking bunch of people sitting there. The only one that was on any trial was Goering. But he had already decided that he was going to be sentenced to death. He knew that. And he was certainly also for the fact that he was going to commit suicide. So he didn't give a heck. Hess, of course, he wasn't with it at all. Sometimes I wonder that he didn't know where he was. I mean, he was eating fiddling all the time. And the others, they were sitting there stone-faced. And von Papen, he probably thought he was going to get off. He had a little bit of the foxy look, but it was none of these guys that had been, this is true, none of these guys who had been the power of the world in those days looked like the power of anything any longer. I thought there was a... if you excuse my expression, was a sorrowful bunch of farts. that's what I did. And I always said that from the beginning. And some of them listened intensely, and some of them looked like they weren't there. And that I'm not too badly off by saying this about them is like later it was proven, for instance, in Spandau, where guys like Dönitz, etc., and was the other name, Herrn, Reden, two generals, they kept bickering all the time. Like two old men, they had to argue about everything and nothing. If you hadn't done that, we hadn't done this, and that's how they went on, day in and day out for 10 years.
Right. How long were you at Nuremberg?
I was only there about 14 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then I bought a Mercedes-Benz for £5 of coffee and 10 cartons of cigarettes. There was no gas in Germany, so people had cars, but no food. I mean, you got a meal for 3 cigarettes, and you got a hotel room for half a bar of soap. So I took that one, and I toured through Germany, and I wanted an interview with Montgomery that I am sure he wasn't willing to give me. So I drove up to his headquarters here anyway, and had a little incident.
What was that?
Yeah, I came in this car, and I knew I had no appointment, and I knew I wasn't going to get into his headquarters in Flensburg, so I had to find out a way to get in. So when I approached the car to the gate, where you had 2 guards standing, I pulled the choke of the car, so the car started spluttering, blah, 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 and stopped. And I go outside the car, and I shook my head, and I said, "Oh, damn it again." And I wrote, "Hi guys, can you help me here?" "Sure," they said. They put the gun, rifles aside and went behind me and pushed me going. So they pushed me through the gate. And then I took off until before they found out what the heck they'd done. And then...
Did you meet Montgomery?
Yeah, Montgomery was standing on the lawn together with lots of other officers, and he saw this Mercedes come in, and a couple of guys running there crazy behind. So he wondered what it was, and they explained it was a journalist. And he came over, actually, and said, "I'm not going to give you any interview, so just get out." So I said, "Thank you, Filmacher," and turned around and drove out at least. But my photographer, at least, he took a picture of him.
Perfect. Talk about Ingmar Bergman.
Ingmar Bergman. When I went to school, I was classmate with Gösta Preselius, who was 40 years in the Swedish Royal Dramatic Theatre, and died 2 years ago. Was the most popular actor in Sweden, because after he'd been neglected for 40 years at the Royal Dramatic Theatre, I mean smaller roles, he suddenly landed a job in a soap opera and became the most popular person in Sweden. That was one classmate. The other classmate, his name was Erland Josephson, who became one of Ingmar Bergman's greatest actors, and together with Liv Ullmann made, I can't really remember all the films they made. And Erland Josephson also became head of the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm later. A third classmate of mine was Ingmar Bergman, who became an actor at the Royal Dramatic Theatre and also famous as playing Hamlet at the Elsinore Castle in Denmark. And we were going to play, we had a sort of theatre club, a literary club I was chairman of, called Concordia. And we were going to stage a play, and Gösta Preselius, who was the firebrand, wanted to play Shylock in The Merchants of Venice. So we decided on that. So we said, well, we need a director. So Gösta says, there's a crazy guy in the old city by the name of Ingmar Bergman. Let's try him. So Lars Ottoson says, you're crazy. It's his father that's the preacher, isn't it? And so, yeah, his father is a preacher. What that had to do with it, said Gösta, he's the only one we can get for 200 kroner, which in today's money is about $20. So here arrives this young man, Ingmar Bergman, in his funny hat to school, goes into our big room and sits down, smoking cigar and cursing us, saying we were the most sorrowful bunch he's ever seen, etc., etc. And he directed The Merchant of Venice with young people like us, creating a performance that the Swedish paper, the biggest paper in Sweden, gave 2 full columns, while a first performance at the opera in Stockholm only got half a column. They say it is an excellent performance by a young man, created by a young man, Ingmar Bergman, who certainly will come to something in life, etc. My father and mother were at the theatre. My father was a director and musical star. And I came home and I talked about Ingmar Bergman all the time. Father, you can't believe this guy. He is so good, I wrote. And of course, my father, he just tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, I'm sure he is. Anyway, that was the meeting with Ingmar Bergman. And the remarkable thing is that in a school of ours, and you stage a play in which you find 2 future heads of the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm and 4 future actors of the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm, plus Ingmar Bergman. That's my first memory of Ingmar Bergman. I came back, and many years ago I went back to my old school that has been transferred into some government office. But it's a very beautiful building with an atrium, 4-story atrium thing. I just wanted to get a little bit of an atmosphere because I was writing something about Ingmar Bergman. I'm coming in and there is a big display of a history of the building. And on that wall is a 3-foot picture, photograph of myself sitting in front, applying my makeup with Ingmar Bergman standing behind.
You never know
That
it was
has
there.
become one of my most treasured photographs today that I keep at home. Ingmar then continued, and I have followed him through the year, basically through one of my best friends by the name of Sven Nykvist, who I think has 2 Oscars as best cinematographer. He did the next 3 last Woody Allen films, and he also did Sleepless in Seattle. And we teamed this young man and did a movie together in Africa, in CinemaScope. And he continued then with Ingmar Bergman, and I followed Ingmar through Sven's stories. Sven is now, we call him the Master of Light. He's living secluded in Sweden now. He's also got Alzheimer's. So his world is dimming. And so... My God, you guys, I mean,
That was quite a gathering of
let
talent.
me
That
say,
was.
but that has nothing to do with this. But I can do many different things. You're a journalist, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. When they asked me in Sweden what I was, for my passport, they said, there's a profession. I said, typewriter. And the thing is, if you can write, many times it leads you into so many damned other things that people say, but how can you make a film? I said, I can write, so I write the film and then I'm there going. And they come up with other things, so you know, I said, why were you in advertising? I said, because I wrote copy. And as written copy, it was good to say, the guy wrote the copy, how do you think we should do this? And I gave an example. So I don't think there is any job that can lead to so many other things as journalism. It's
It's a fun profession.
One last question.
what am I here writing a book?
He is.
No, I'm writing it.
He's the article. One last question. You are the first person to drive a car from the North Cape to Cape Town.
Yes.
How did that happen?
It happened because I got angry. I was actually I was head of the sales, promotion and advertising, etc., and issuing a magazine for Ford Motor Company. That was where in Scandinavia, and also taking care of their ice racing team. And I came after a guy who had had the job for 16 years. And he came back in another position, but he wanted to come in and steal a little bit from me because he had to get back into corporation and a better position. And there was a big meeting for the directors discussing next year's budget, etc. When he said, suddenly it irritated me so many times, he said, I've been advertising manager for this company, he says, for 16 years, so maybe it might have some weight in what I said. And I don't know, I just clicked in my head, and I turned to him and I said, you've been advertising director for this company for 16 years, you can be it for another 16 years. And I just stood up and left the room. The director, or the manager of the company, president, called up and said, what are you going to do now? And I said, you'll see. I came up on that, I got to do something that people will say, because I can't go out and get another job after firing myself like that. So I got to go do something where people say, of course he quit because he had this so much better to do. So I said, what can I do that no one has done? They have all these things. So I said, no one has driven a car from North Cape to Cape Town, the longest overland drive that we made. I discarded the other from Normandy to Vladivostok in Russia because you couldn't get through Siberia, you couldn't get the licenses. So this was the drive. So I decided to do that, and I had a publisher, and I called up a friend of mine who had been head of truck department at Ford, and now was head of Volkswagen in Sweden. And I asked him if he would give me a car, a Volkswagen, for this drive. And he said, sure, Lars, we're happy to. So I got one, and then I made a deal with a Swedish newspaper, the Stockholm, second largest, to write articles for them, and they put a 4-column picture of me on the front page with the text under the picture in front of the Volkswagen, where it says, Ford's advertising manager drives Volkswagen from Cape to Cape. And I can tell you, the president of Ford didn't like that very much. And that's how I started. It started because I got angry. And then I did the whole trip, and it was a trip full of adventures and full of thrills, and it led to a lot of strange things afterwards that have crept up in my life and come close to me. I broke down a couple of times because on the way down, the man that was my photographer, his name was Bengt Lindström. He became later the photographer for Lasse Hellström, the Swedish director, who was very well known in the United States, but he started off his fame, I think, with the film My Life as a Dog. And then, if you remember, then I think another one he wrote was lately called Chocolate.
Chocolate, yeah.
And he was Oscar nominated for, yeah. He directed the film in which about that school doctor. What's the name of that British actor who got the Oscar?
Russell Crowe?
Huh?
Russell Crowe? Crowe? Russell?
The latest one. They got an Oscar for he's played the doctor. Anyway, I can't remember.
Don't know.
Suddenly, one name of an actor that's been in so many films just slipped me. He's one of the most known British actors. And so I did the trip, and I came back in one piece. I returned to Africa later to write another book and to make a film with Sven Nykvist as photographer. That's why I named the name. It was Sweden's first film in CinemaScope. It's called Gorilla. It was a story of the mountain gorillas. We didn't have as much equipment, but I actually made a film about the mountain gorillas 30 years before they filmed Gorillas in the Mist.
Yep.
And it was more of a nature film than anything else. It was a beautiful photo with Sven Nykvist, of course, taking it. We didn't have as much about the gorillas as the other. We remember it was only Sven Nykvist, an assistant photographer, and myself who carried the camera load. We had to get to the gorillas, and they didn't come up and pose for us. So all I could hire was a lot of natives from the village and ask them to make a lot of noise. So they came out with drums or whatever and formed a circle. We found out first where the gorillas were, and they formed a big circle, and we tightened the circle and had it open in one place where we put the camera. And my idea was that the gorilla is a friendly and peaceful animal, basically. And if he hears all the noise, he will want to get away from it. So he moves in the direction where there's the least noise, and that's where we have the cameras. And of course that happened.
Yeah.
They did that 3 or 4 times and filmed them. I think good pictures. And that's all we could do. when I compared that to Gorillas in the Mist that had 135 people from America, and we were 3, and I was carrying the the sound equipment. I was the sound engineer. I was everything. But it was fun. It was CinemaScope. And and the reason why Sven Nykvist was interested in doing this is that his father was the first missionary in Africa. And he went on to see that part, and I wrote a book for him called The Journey to Lambarene, which was right to see. And another odd thing, we were stationed in Iceland stayed for about a year at a station at the Ituri River in the Pygmy jungle, where there was a man called Jean de Medina who was tired of shooting elephants for the Belgian army as meat and started to try to tame them when everybody says was impossible.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, Hannibal did it, so I can do it. At the same time, he became licensed and a major in the Belgian army. He was a Portuguese mulatto to catch the okapi for the various zoos around the world. And he was a very original, fantastic man.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed with him. And he had these okapis. And then I don't know what happened. I read in a book several years ago that the okapi was an endangered species that had been taken care of by the Metro Zoo in Miami. So I went and I asked the Metro Zoo in Miami about this okapi deal. And they said, we have nothing to do with it any longer. It's Dr. Lucas. What is he?